The United States has just sanctioned one of China's busiest ports, and within days, chaos has erupted at sea. Oil tankers are diverting, global shipping is snarled, and Beijing has struck back with its own sanctions on US-linked shipbuilders. Are we watching the start of a full maritime decoupling between the world's two biggest powers? This is global chaos. Hi, welcome back to the channel. As we discussed in a recent video, the USA has recently imposed sanctions against a whole port in China. So this isn't against one individual company, which is what historically the sanctions have been targeting. This is against a crucial piece of infrastructure. And the Rejao port in the east coast of China actually handles huge volumes of oil, over 600,000 barrels per day. So it's a crucial artery for the refineries that are located in that area. Now, officially, the USA imposed these sanctions due to the fact that China was buying Iranian oil, and there have been long-standing sanctions against Iran. However, this is now developing into a much bigger story, and we're seeing the trade war between the USA and China, which erupted back in April when Donald Trump first imposed sanctions against China. And since that time, China has done things like restricting the supply of rare earth minerals, which are crucial to many industries across the world. So in response to that, Donald Trump recently imposed a 100% tariff on all imports, an additional tariff that is on top of the 30% that's currently in place, might even be as high as 40% because there's another 10% penalty for being a member of BRICS. So he's imposed an additional 100% on top of those existing tariffs. And in response to that, China has come back and said that it's going to take action against the USA. So we are seeing the tension rising. But the imposition of these sanctions against this port has really accelerated things. So companies, banks, and insurers are now at risk of secondary sanctions if they're involved with any company that is dealing with this port. So overnight, Rejao has become radioactive. Nobody wants to deal with it. Now, this is obviously impacting on Russia as well, because Russian oil is going to that port as well as many other ports in China. Since the sanctions were imposed, dozens of tankers have turned away from Rejao, so they don't want to dock there, and they're now having to go to other Chinese ports, which are becoming heavily congested. So that's causing logistical problems for those other ports. And freight costs have jumped by more than 15%, and lots of ships are now idling offshore because they're waiting to be told what to do. So this has caused chaos in a very short space of time. And these sanctions are now rippling through the entire system because even non-sanctioned vessels are facing penalties because they're docking at a blacklisted port. So even if your vessel has nothing to do with Iranian oil or Russian oil or anything like that, you can't go to that port. So lots of different container ships and just normal deliveries that have nothing to do with sanctioned trade are now having to abandon this port because the whole port is basically blacklisted. So if you go there, then your company runs the risk of also being blacklisted. Western insurers have withdrawn their insurance cover on any ships that are going to that port. So even if the captain of the ship, even if the company behind that ship is happy to dock there, the fact that the insurer is saying, well, you won't have any insurance if you do dock there, means that they're going to have to divert away from it. And tankers without insurance can't unload because if there was a spillage or some sort of disaster, then clearly the company or the tanker itself would be liable for the costs of any clear up. And captains are having to change their destinations now. So this is causing real problems on the water. So you might be thinking, well, why don't all of the Russian ships just go to that port taking Russian oil because they don't care about the sanctions anyway? Well, there is actually a problem there because quite a lot of Russian oil that's going to China is actually going under the price cap. So the new price cap that's in place, which is coming in around about 15% market levels, China is officially buying some of that oil. So some of those deliveries are actually legitimate. But those legitimate deliveries can no longer be made to this port because the whole port has been cancelled. It's basically toxic. Nobody wants to deal with it. So that's causing problems for those vessels that are carrying legitimate Russian oil that's trading below the price cap. And also the dark fleet, the shadow fleet, which is moving millions of barrels of Russian oil every single day. They don't want to go there because whilst they can turn off their transponders and become invisible, if they're identified as actually being at that port, because satellite imagery would enable you to say, actually, there is a ship there now, and we can see the name of that ship. So even if it's invisible to radar, you can still see it from all of the imagery, then that would then be hit with secondary sanctions. So this is causing wide-scale disruption, not just for China, well, mostly for China, but also for Russia, because they're now losing one of the ports that they were delivering to. So even the Russian oil is struggling to be able to be delivered. Now, as I mentioned in my previous video, China isn't taking this lying down. They're actually coming back with their own countermeasures. And it's now been announced that China has sanctioned 5 US-linked subsidiaries of Hanwha Ocean, and they're now considering putting additional inspections and delays onto any ships that are flagged as being US-linked. And the Commerce Ministry in China has warned of additional firm countermeasures. And Chinese media has called this all maritime bullying by Washington. So China is really unhappy. And this is only within a matter of days of this sanction being put into place. As we go forward over the course of the next few weeks and months, this is going to cause real problems, because if that oil can't be delivered into that region, then the refineries that are there won't be able to operate. They won't have the capacity to be able to produce all of their refined oil products, such as gasoline and diesel, which are needed by companies and people within that area. So we could see fuel shortages starting to spread all across this region for something that is basically historically an oil artery. All of the oil came into the port and then spread right across all of these districts. So if the crude oil isn't being delivered, it's going to cause a shutdown in this area because nobody's going to be able to continue operating. So all of this is obviously very bad news for China, but it's also potentially bad news for the USA and the global economy, because what we are seeing here is a decoupling of the relationship between the two largest economies in the world. They've got the biggest level of trade each way. So China exports a huge volume of goods to the USA, but the USA also sells around $140 billion worth of goods into China. So it's a symbiotic relationship. Both of them need each other to continue growing. But unfortunately, we're seeing ties between these two countries being cut. So the USA is now cutting back in terms of the supply of AI chips, finance, and trade to China. And China is obviously tightening things like the supply of rare earths and graphite. And China is now looking to develop its relationship with the BRICS nations: Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and a variety of other nations. So we're seeing a division in the global economy between the East and the West. And if that continues, it's likely to have a dampening impact on the growth of the global economy, because whilst we go through a period of significant change and companies need to find new partners and new places to sell to, it's likely that we will see a dip in sales, a dip in revenue, and therefore a dip in profit. So this action potentially has really serious implications for the economy of China and the USA, but also the global economy, because if they're slowing down, then they will be buying less from everybody else, and so all the other economies will slow down also. So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this follow-up video talking about the actual reality of what the sanctions on this Chinese port have meant to Chinese trade. So what we've talked about in today's video is that immediately after these sanctions were announced, we've seen tankers turning away from this port because it was an instantaneous ban. And captains of those ships and the companies that own the ships and the companies that own all of the products that are on those ships don't want to be hit by secondary sanctions. They've seen what the USA has been doing. They've been taking really decisive action against people who are going against the wishes of the USA. So all of those ships are now turning away from this port and having to go to other places in China. And that's causing chaos and congestion at those ports, because a port is a well-oiled machine. You have your logistics laid out, you know which tankers are coming in, how long it's going to take to unload those tankers, and it takes a long period of time. When you see these super tankers, they are absolutely massive. So if we're talking about an oil tanker that maybe is carrying up to 2 million barrels of oil in one cargo, that's obviously quite a big job to get all of that oil off safely and then get that tanker out. And then you bring the next tanker in. So you don't really have the capacity to suddenly take on all of the tankers from somebody else's port. So these tankers are going elsewhere and they're now forming queues. There's lots of ships idling in the ocean, waiting to be told when they can dock. So this is a bit like you when you go to the airport being told that your flight's been delayed and you just have to sit around for 7, 8, 10 hours, maybe even a couple of days. Now, that's obviously not good for you, but it's very bad for business because business needs all of those deliveries to be made. All of the companies in China that are buying either this oil or cargo or other things that are being affected, they're going to see delays in those deliveries. That's going to cause production problems, sales problems, issues with regards to the supply chain and logistics. So there's a really big knock-on implication here to all of the businesses that have all of those products that are in transit. But when you look at what's happening with that region where the port is located, it suddenly had all of its supplies switched off overnight. And a lot of those supplies were oil because this was a really important delivery point for all of the crude oil that's coming into China, which then goes to the refineries in China, is converted into gasoline and diesel and usable products, and then is distributed to all of the companies and people that needs them. Now, if that supply has stopped, which it has, that means that that area is now running dry of crude oil. So that's a big problem for those refineries because they need to operate at maximum capacity. To get the lowest possible price and to be more efficient, you need to have constant throughput of crude oil. If you see a reduction, then that's going to reduce your capacity, but it's going to reduce your operating efficiency and increase your costs and reduce your profitability. So it's bad news from a financial point of view, but worse than that, it's actually bad news from a supply point of view. There's going to be shortages in China because those refineries aren't going to be producing as much oil and gasoline and diesel. Therefore, companies and individuals won't have it. We may see people not being able to go to work, deliveries not being made, companies running short. So this is a real disaster for this region. Now, China has fought back. It's now applied sanctions against some US vessels. And what we are seeing is a really big increase in the trade war between the USA and China. And as I mentioned earlier in the video, that's going to be bad news for both of those economies because they're their single biggest trading partner. China exports, the biggest market for China is the USA for exports, and the biggest market for the USA is China. So they need each other. If they're now turning their backs on each other, we're going to see a huge reduction in trade, which will reduce income and profitability for all of the companies involved. That will reduce the growth in both of those economies, which will have a subsequent knock-on impact to the global economy because USA and China being the biggest economies, they're doing the most trade with everybody else. So if they're growing at a lower rate, they're not going to be buying as much things, and therefore everybody else will suffer. So the overall summary of today's video is that this sanction against the Chinese port, it has been very effective. It's now causing major problems in that area. It's causing problems for China and the USA, and this could be a major problem for the global economy for the rest of 2025 and going into 2026. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's video, you found it useful, informative and thought-provoking. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Thank you for watching this video all the way through to the end, and thank you to everyone that supported me. If you bought me a coffee, sent me YouTube super thanks, or signed up as a patron or a member or a buy me a coffee member, thank you so much for that support, and here's something to put a smile on your face.